For members' statements has concluded. Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister has repeatedly announced that wages would go up, but page 37 of budget paper number 1 confirms that real wages will be cut. How is it possible that after 8 long years of this government, the Prime Minister can rack up $1 trillion of Liberal debt and Australians get their real wages cut?
The Prime Minister has the call.
The budget that the Treasurer handed down last night was a plan to secure Australians' recovery. And that first and foremost, Mr Speaker, means getting Australians back into work, getting Australians back into jobs. Now, Mr Speaker, I'll hand over to the Treasurer in just one moment to address the specific issue that the Leader of the Opposition has raised. As we've known, over the course of this current financial year, Mr Speaker, and through the pandemic period, there were many initiatives undertaken by the government which has had an impact on how the inflation rate has been impacted as a result of those measures, whether it's through childcare, and that's provided timing differences, Mr Speaker, in relation to technically how these matters are measured. But what I do know, Mr Speaker, is the economic recovery plan that is set out in the budget that the Treasurer handed down last night is going to mean more jobs, it's going to mean more investment, Mr Speaker, and it's going to mean more support for Australians in work. It's going to mean lower taxes. It's going to mean, Mr Speaker, better infrastructure.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker, it was a very specific question. It didn't go to the cuts they've got to infrastructure over the next 4 years or anything else. It went to page 37 of budget paper number 1.
The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Leader of the House on the point of order.
Mr Speaker, that is nothing more than a stunt. The Leader of the Opposition has been warned about it before. There was no point of order. There was no point of order. Holding up books for the cameras doesn't substitute for some sort of substantive point. The Prime Minister was perfectly in order.
The Leader of the House will resume his seat. If members on both sides will cease interjecting, I'll address this in 2 parts as delicately as I can. It is right that members shouldn't use props; they're undesirable. But I think holding up the budget paper has been. No, if I stop every time someone interrupts me, this might take till 3:10. The Leader of the Opposition did raise, I think, a legitimate point of order. The Prime Minister was certainly in order up until the fact he broadened out into a number of other issues, so he needs to obviously relate his material to the question. But I also say to the Leader of the House, in terms of the point of order, I'm not sure that he necessarily heard all of the question when it was asked. The Prime Minister, the Treasurer. Okay.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Real wages obviously takes into account inflation, Mr Speaker, and we have seen pretty modest inflation, so the real wages are at their 10-year average. Now, the Leader of the Opposition specifically refers to the fact that we will see, according to the budget papers, mid this year, we will see inflation at around 3.5%, Mr Speaker. Now, that is because we saw inflation go negative the year prior for the first time in 60 years as we put in place emergency measures like free childcare, Mr Speaker. But what the Leader of the Opposition fails to acknowledge is that the best way to drive up wages, real or nominal, is to lower the unemployment rate, Mr Speaker. And it is under this government, under this coalition, that the unemployment rate today is lower than when we came to government, Mr Speaker. At 5.6%, the unemployment rate is lower than when we came to government, even after the biggest economic shock since the Great Depression. Now, Mr Speaker, in last night's budget, we have indicated that we are seeking to drive the unemployment rate even further, from 5.6% down to 5.1% before the pandemic hit, and even lower, Mr Speaker. And as the RBA and Treasury have said, in order to drive an acceleration in wages, you need to have an unemployment rate with a 4 in front of it. And in last night's budget papers, Treasury printed a forecast for the unemployment rate to go under 5 by the end of next year. Our policies, more investment in skills, more investment in infrastructure, more investment through tax relief, will helping to drive more Australians in job. That's our record, and that's what we'll defend every day of the week.
The member for Bass.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister inform the House of how the Morrison government's budget is a plan to secure the next stage of Australia's recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic and recession?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Bass for her question. She'll know, like I think many in this House, particularly the government members, that last night, as the Treasurer handed down the budget, the response from so many, welcoming so many of those measures, but most importantly, Mr Speaker, I note the comments by Chris Richardson, the esteemed economist, who said this: "It is absolutely the right budget for the times, Mr Speaker. The fight against COVID has become the fight against unemployment." And he's right, Mr Speaker, and that is exactly what this budget is designed to do as we secure the Australian recovery, Mr Speaker, and we take up that fight against unemployment, Mr Speaker, through the measures that were handed down in this budget. But importantly, what this recognises is that we understand the times that we are in right now, Mr Speaker. And those times are that we have a global pandemic that is not better, Mr Speaker, but worse than it was a year ago. A global pandemic that has raged through the developed world and is now raging through the developing world as we speak. And, Mr Speaker, it also comes at a time when we know that the economic impact on the global economy means that this pandemic recession is 30 times worse than what we saw in the global financial crisis. So this is a significant and this is a very difficult time, Mr Speaker, in which we are putting together this recovery plan. Now, Mr Speaker, our actions as a government over the course of the past 18 months have backed Australians in through the course of this pandemic to support the decisions that they are making to get them and their families and their businesses and their employees through what has been such a difficult time, and to manage those health impacts. So it means if Australia had had the average fatality rate of the OECD nations, Mr Speaker, there would have been 30,000 more fatalities as a result of COVID, Mr Speaker, in this country over the course of this pandemic to this time. And in addition, Mr Speaker, there are more people employed today than before the pandemic began. So Australia has made great advances in this fight against unemployment and in this fight against the COVID-19 virus, Mr Speaker. But we cannot put those gains at risk, and that's why securing Australia's recovery, Mr Speaker, is what this budget is all about. A plan, Mr Speaker, to secure that recovery which will ensure that the gains that have been hard-won will not be lost, that those gains will be embedded, Mr Speaker, and the jobs that have been taken back, and those million Australians, Mr Speaker, finding their way back into the workforce, and the employers who've made it possible, and the bravery of those Australians getting that job done. That's what this budget's about, a plan for securing Australia's recovery.
The member for Rankin.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. According to page 37 of Budget Paper 1, workers who've been lucky enough to hang on to their jobs through the pandemic will now have their real wages cut. What is the point of an 8-year-old government racking up $1 trillion of Liberal debt when workers' wages aren't keeping up with their bills?
Members on both sides, the Deputy Prime Minister. The Treasurer has the call.
It's surprising to get a question from the member for Rankin on the issue of real wages, when real wages to the December quarter were higher than when Labor left office, Mr Speaker. Higher than when Labor left office. Now, the reality is,
Member for Griffith,
that the key to driving higher wages is a tighter labour market with more people in work. Now, Mr Speaker, this is an inconvenient truth for the member for Rankin, who always seeks to make politics in this chamber rather than acknowledging the national interest, but 500,000 jobs have been created since last budget. That in the MyEFO in December last year, Treasury were forecasting an unemployment rate at 7.5% in the March quarter, and today it is 5.6%. Now, Mr Speaker, we announced in last night's budget significant measures to invest more in infrastructure, more in skills. Mr Speaker, tax relief for families, business investment incentives, childcare reforms to drive greater workforce participation, all designed to make our economy stronger. But, Mr Speaker, the measures for the Morrison government have been targeted, designed to get more people in work. And we knew that we had to transition in last night's budget off emergency support measures like JobKeeper. And you know that the member for Rankin was begging us to continue spending more than $2 billion a month on JobKeeper, Mr Speaker. But we held firm. And the good news for the House is that since JobKeeper ended, around 120,000 Australians have come off income support, which is a direct pointer to the resilience and the strength of the labour market. Mr Speaker, the member for Rankin described what Australia went through last year as the deepest, most damaging recession for almost 100 years. And the fact that Australia is now recovering strongly ahead of the global pack is something that we can all know that the Australian people have helped achieve. And it's not the result of luck, because Australians make their own luck.
The member for Fisher.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Will the Treasurer outline to the House how last night's budget is a plan to secure our recovery and how it maintains the Morrison government's ongoing commitment to generating jobs and lowering taxes for Australian families so they can keep more of their hard-earned money?
The Treasurer.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Fisher, who indeed in her previous life was an apprentice carpenter, Mr Speaker, somebody who understands the importance of apprenticeships, something which was backed in last night's budget. But importantly for the member for Fisher, more than 63,000 taxpayers in his electorate got a tax cut last night, Mr Speaker, and more than 7,000 businesses in his electorate, Mr Speaker, will be able to access business tax incentives as a result of measures in last night's budget. Now, Mr Speaker, at the height of this pandemic, Australia was staring into the economic abyss. Treasury feared that unemployment could reach as high as 15%, that GDP growth could fall by more than 20%. The Morrison government responded with an unprecedented amount of economic support, now $291 billion. Programs like JobKeeper, which help support 3.8 million Australians in a job. Programs like JobSeeker, which help support 1.5 million Australians who are out of work. The Cash Flow Boost, which supported 800,000 businesses and not-for-profit. And as a result of those measures, we have seen Australia become the first of the major advanced economies to have employment rise above the pre-pandemic levels, with today 75,000 more Australians in work since the beginning of the pandemic. Now, Mr Speaker, in last night's budget, we announced further investment in skills, $2.7 billion for more apprenticeships. We announced more money for the Job Trainer program so it can support 450,000 training places. We supported, Mr Speaker, new measures to incentivise employers to take on long-term unemployed, investment in foundational skills, maths, English and computer literacy. We announced in last night's budget $15 billion of new infrastructure spending to keep our 10-year pipeline going. And of course, in last night's budget, we announced significant tax relief which will support more than 10 million Australians, low and middle income earners, get up to $1,080 in their pocket as a result of measures supported on this side of the House. This side of the House believes in lower taxes. This side of the House believes in a stronger economy. This side of the House believes in creating more jobs, and that's what last night's budget will deliver.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister confirm this fact? Page 37 of Budget Paper number 1 shows a cut to real wages.
The Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, the budget papers are tabled and they're there for all members to be able to note. And I refer the member to the Treasurer's earlier response to this matter when it was raised. And, Mr Speaker, we came off a year last year where inflation actually, Mr Speaker, was negative. And then we've moved into a year, Mr Speaker, where we've seen prices adjust in the following year. And so it's not surprising, Mr Speaker, if those opposite think that inflation is going to be running at over 3%, Mr Speaker, then they'd be expecting interest rates to rise as well, Mr Speaker. And we all know from the Governor of the Reserve Bank that that is not what he has got planned in these public statements, Mr Speaker. So the Leader of the Opposition may seek to delve in these things, Mr Speaker, but what he doesn't appreciate, what he doesn't understand, Mr Speaker, for a Leader of the Opposition to have spent so much time in this parliament, so much time here, Mr Speaker, and have so little experience
Prime Minister
in
resume his
understanding
seat. No, the Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business will resume his seat. Members on my right. Members on my right. Say to the Prime Minister, he shouldn't refer that way to the Leader of the Opposition because he didn't ask the question. The question was asked by the Manager of Opposition Business, and I do think up until that point the Prime Minister was in order, given the nature of the question. So I'll call the Prime Minister and listen.
Responding to the interjections of the Leader of the Opposition, which
not
are usually
not a good practice, Prime Minister.
fairly regular, Mr Speaker. But Mr Speaker, this budget, securing Australia's economic recovery, Mr Speaker, securing that recovery is what this budget is all about. And that budget supports jobs, it drives unemployment down, which supports wages, Mr Speaker.
Manager of Opposition Business, the Prime Minister concluded. And I'll call the member for Clark.
Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, yesterday's federal budget listed 10 city and regional deals, including, surprise, surprise, the Launceston City deal for the marginal electorate of Bass. But there was no mention of the Hobart City deal, which was announced with much fanfare 2 years ago and which has seen little action beyond the $30 million social housing package I negotiated. Prime Minister, remember the Hobart deal promises the Antarctic precinct at Mac Point, activation of the rail corridor and to address Hobart's terrible traffic congestion and housing crisis. So when is the government going to deliver these vital initiatives for Tasmania's capital, or don't they pass the pork barrelling test? No wonder the public detests politics and politicians.
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The member for Clark can speak for himself, Mr Speaker. But I thank the member for Clark for his question. I was in Hobart with the former Tasmanian Premier Will Hodgman in February of 2019, where we announced that deal, Mr Speaker, with around $1.7 billion in investment. We also expect that deal to create over 1,400 jobs. And before I hand over to the minister responsible, Mr Speaker, let me update you on a couple of things. Design work on the replacement of the Bridgewater Bridge is continuing. We expect the Commonwealth investment in this project will be some $461 million, and we anticipate works will begin on that, Mr Speaker, next year. Direct flights from Hobart to Auckland on 22nd of April 2021. They were recommenced for the first time since 1996, and Air New Zealand is now flying the service twice a week into Hobart, Mr Speaker. 48 properties have already been tenanted through the $30 million investment to deliver at least 100 new dwellings in the Greater Hobart region in partnership with community housing providers. I know a topic that the member is keenly interested in and played a key role in when we formed this deal. And City Deal partners are considering the findings of a study of potential transport solutions to the Northern Suburbs Transit Corridor, which will help to identify the most economic and efficient option. I'll ask the Minister to add further to the answer.
The Minister has the call.
I thank the member for his question. I thank the Prime Minister for the opportunity to add to his answer. Certainly the Morrison government is very focused on the Hobart City Deal. As the Prime Minister mentioned, one of the elements of the City Deal is the $82.3 million commitment for the provision of border services to allow international flights to come into Hobart Airport. So I was very pleased to be able to represent the Morrison government on the 22nd of April this year, to be at the Hobart Airport to welcome the first international flight coming in from Auckland. In other words, a key element of the City Deal being delivered. Now, another element of the City Deal, as the member rightly refers to, and indeed had some important involvement in, is affordable housing, a $30 million commitment to affordable housing. I was very pleased to have the chance to visit a group of houses which have been built under that program recently. I visited Kathleen Moore, who resides in one of those homes. She thanked the government for her new home, and she made the point that her rent was previously 80% of her pension, and now, thanks to these new housing arrangements, is 25% of her pension. Of course, as the Prime Minister's rightly said, Bridgewater Bridge, a major component of the Hobart City Deal, and work are well advanced on that. And of course, in relation to the Antarctic Science Precinct and Macquarie Point, a detailed business case presently being developed and very extensive engagement with stakeholders, and I've been pleased to have discussions with the State Minister, with the relevant council mayors and other stakeholders on these projects.
The Minister's time has concluded. I call the member for Cowper.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister, Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Will the Deputy Prime Minister inform the House how the Morrison-McCormack government's budget is securing our recovery by continuing the delivery of vital infrastructure across regional Australia?
The Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Cowper for his question, Mr Speaker. And last night we have announced in the budget an additional $1 billion for the local roads and community infrastructure, and for the member for Cowper, for the 5 councils that he either has wholly and solely in his fine mid-north coast electorate, or indeed shares with the tremendous members of Page and Lyne, we see considerable uplift in the amount of money that they are going to get to spend on local roads and community infrastructure. Bellingen Shire get an additional $1.1 million. The Coffs Harbour City Council, finally represented by the Mayor there, Denise Knight, $2.7 million. Kempsey Shire, and we were there recently at the Community Hub, the project which is going to make such a difference for the social outcomes of that great place, $2.3 million. Nambucca Valley, $1.5 million. Port Macquarie Hastings Council, Peter Pinson, we caught up with her as well, $3.6 million. So last night's announcement for the 537 councils across Australia, but indeed those in Cowper, $11.4 million, and it takes the total for those 5 councils to $26.9 million, and that's significant investment in their shires. And not just that, but the infrastructure right throughout Cowper. Coffs Harbour Bypass, it's changing the landscape of the members' electorate, indeed taking 12,000 vehicles out of the town centre each day, and that is so significant. The Commonwealth has allocated $1.46 billion for the 14-kilometre bypass of Coffs, and there are currently 53 active contracts on the project, and what they are all doing is creating jobs, creating opportunities, creating investment, making procurement for those small businesses around Coffs Harbour. 2,000 of those jobs are going to be in Coffs Harbour of the 12,000 across the lifetime of this project. And indeed, the infrastructure budget last night announced by the Treasurer has $15.2 billion of new project commitments, $15.2 million. but don't just take my word for it. Chris Mellum, I know he's known to many of those opposite, CEO of the Civil Contractors Federation. He said investing in civil infrastructure projects generates jobs, boosts business confidence and underpins economic growth. That's what he said, and he is right, of course. And certainly regional Australia is a big beneficiary of the infrastructure budget announced last night. The infrastructure pipeline last night, 10-year plan, 30,000 additional jobs on top of the 100,000 that the $110 billion of infrastructure is supporting right throughout the economy, and certainly, as I say again, in those country areas.
The member's time has concluded. I call the member for Ballarat.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. The front pages of Australia's newspapers reported an infrastructure bonanza would be announced in last night's budget. So why does page 84 of budget paper number 1 show a $3.3 billion cut to infrastructure investment over the next 4 years? Why announce a splurge but deliver a cut?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
I have got a media release, thank you, member for Watson. I've got the media release from the member for Ballarat.
Members on my left, member for Griffith.
I noticed that the ALP have got a little logo that they're now putting on their next to their media release. It's got a 3-word slogan, would you believe? A 3-word slogan, all about spin. The 3-word slogan that we need is that one, securing Australia's recovery, because that's what the budget does. But I read the media release closely. There is no underspend. There is no cut. The budget makes for infrastructure rollout $110 billion right across the economy. 30,000 additional jobs last night. But as I explained to the member for Ballarat yesterday, what we do is we pay on delivery. We pay on milestones. Now, it might be the Labor way to pay for a job that isn't yet completed. They might have done that in those 6 sorry, dysfunctional, chaotic years, but we pay on delivery. And so we're getting on with the job. And as you heard the Treasurer last night, the new commitments that we've made, the $15.2 billion of commitments that we are making right across every state and every territory. And indeed, those Labor ministers, those state and territory Labor ministers, who I advised on Sunday night as a courtesy call about the infrastructure rollout, which, yes, the member for Ballarat says was on the front pages of the paper, and good on the press gallery for acknowledging what a great budget it is, what an infrastructure budget it is. They are also very much in favour of the infrastructure rollout that we've got. But those Labor ministers, whether it was Mark Bailey in Queensland, whether it was Jacinda Allen in Victoria, whether it was Rita Saffioti, Eva Lawler, they all were acknowledging the projects that we are building in their states or territories. Chris Steele from the ACT, indeed, another to say thank you, well done, and that's what we're doing. We're getting on with the job of building the infrastructure that Australia needs. There is no cut. There is no cut. The only cut I've seen this week was the haircut I got the other day. Good little small business taking advantage of all the tax incentives that we're doing and we're getting. That's why we're getting on with the job of putting in place the infrastructure that Australia needs. An additional, did I mention it before, 30,000 jobs in the infrastructure rollout last night. And already our $110 billion is supporting 100,000 jobs. You could have only dreamt, opposition leader, of the money when you were the infrastructure minister, and yet you didn't get that sort of money.
Deputy Prime Minister's time has concluded. And I call the member for Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer update the House on how last night's budget will continue to secure our economic recovery and generate more jobs?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I acknowledge the member for Robertson. And I recently had the opportunity to visit her electorate, and we visited a business called Terrigal Electric, and we met with the first female apprentice electrician that was taken on by that particular business, again with the support of the coalition government. Now, Mr Speaker, there are more than 50,000 taxpayers in the electorate of Robertson that got a tax cut last night, Mr Speaker. There are more than 16,000 businesses in the electorate of Robertson that will be able to access the business tax incentives that we announced last night, Mr Speaker. And in last night's budget, we announced a series of measures that are part of our plan to create 250,000 more jobs across the Australian economy, building on the 500,000 jobs that have been created since last budget. Now, Mr Speaker, the labour market has shown enormous resilience. We've seen real gains across the economy as we've managed to suppress the virus. But the virus still runs rampant around the world. Europe has gone into a double-dip recession, and we cannot be complacent here in Australia. We have to lock in those gains. Otherwise, we could lose those gains. And that's why last night saw record investment in skills, record investment in infrastructure, record investment in providing further tax relief to Australian businesses with investment incentives, Mr Speaker, more investments in energy and, of course, more support for childcare to boost workforce participation. And the budget was well received by a number of key stakeholders. This is what Infrastructure Partnership said about the budget last night. The federal government has walked its talk on infrastructure funding, backing up last year's record spending with an even bigger outlay in this year's budget. This is what the Housing Industry Association said about last night's budget. The extension of the boosting apprentice commencement wage subsidy to allow more new apprentices and trainees to start their career in a trade will help grow the next generation of tradies and home builders. This is what the Business Council of Australia said about last night's budget. This budget propels Australia out of the pandemic and lays the foundation for a jobs-led recovery. And this is what the Australian Industry Group said about last night's budget. It locks in the recovery from recession and shifts gear from emergency measures to investing in the economy for the longer term. Mr Speaker, last night's budget was for all Australians. Last night's budget was to create more jobs. Last night's budget will create more jobs.
The member for Solomon.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. I refer to page 153 of budget paper number 2. Can the Prime Minister confirm that? Can the Deputy Prime Minister confirm that just 1% of the infrastructure funds for the Northern Territory announced in last night's budget will be spent in the next 4 years?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call. Members on my left.
I thank the member for Solomon for his question. Indeed I do. And indeed the Northern Territory is a vital part of the infrastructure component of the budget. And I speak to those members in the Northern Territory all the time, whether it's Leah Finocchiaro, the leader of the CLP there in that great territory, whether it's indeed Michael Gunner or Eva Lawler. And I speak to them. I acknowledge the role that they play in wanting to build, needing to build, demanding to build, expecting to build and deserving to have the infrastructure that we are rolling out right across the nation. But, as I just told the member for Ballarat in the previous question, there is no cut to infrastructure spending. We are getting on with the delivery, whether it's in the Northern Territory or anywhere else across this land. Overall infrastructure funding has increased over the forward estimates and has increased since last budget, which was just in October last year, from $60 billion over the 4 years from 2020-21 to $70 billion over the 4 years from 2021-22. Now, $70 billion is a higher number than $60 billion. Okay, I just put that out there. The 21-22 budget includes
the Deputy Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker. Point of order on relevance. It was a very specific question. It went to new investment in the Northern Territory, as shown on page 153 of the budget papers. It's really easy to identify. It's all the gaps, all the zeros.
The Leader of the Opposition
there.
has made his point of order. I do say to the Deputy Prime Minister it was a specific question, but having said that, the way it's phrased can't compel, as I've said. Member for Sydney, as I've said before, questions might be framed to try and elicit a yes-no answer. Even though that's the case, the minister is not compelled to give a yes-no answer. But the Deputy Prime Minister must be relevant to the question of infrastructure in the Northern Territory. And I'll call him back to the dispatch box, but infrastructure outside the Northern Territory isn't relevant. It's just he can refer to the budget in regards to the Northern Territory.
The Northern Territory will benefit from the additional $1 billion we are placing in the road safety package. I see the member for Solomon nodding. The Northern Territory will benefit from a further $1 billion in funding for the local roads and community infrastructure program. The Northern Territory will benefit from the defence spending that we are doing in the Northern Territory, $760 million. The Northern Territory
I just say
will
to
benefit.
the Deputy Prime Minister, he's been asked about a specific part of the budget, and he is not responsible for defence spending, and that is not what the question was about. The Deputy Prime Minister needs to be relevant to the question or wind up his answer.
$150 million, Mr Speaker, for Phase 2 of the Northern Territory National Network highway upgrades. $173.6 million towards the 6th corridor of the Roads of Strategic Importance initiative. Now, that supports the development of the gas industry in the Beetaloo sub-basin. And indeed, $0.3 million for a development study of the proposed Tennant Creek multimodal facility and rail terminal, which I visited not that long ago. And when you might ask, well, we're getting on with the job. We will work with the Northern Territory government because that's what we do. They give us their priorities, we invest in them, we do it on a 80-20 basis when it comes to regional areas. Unlike Labor, it's only 50-50, and that's why, let me tell you, Territory and state governments love when the Liberals and Nationals are in government because they get more value for their infrastructure dollar.
The member for Higgins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Women. Will the Minister advise the House on how Australian women are playing a vital role in our economic comeback and how this budget supports them to do so?
The Minister representing the Minister for Women.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Higgins for her question. Economic security goes hand in hand with financial independence, and this budget is a budget that gives women more choices than they've ever had before in the workforce. Within our $3.4 billion women's budget, we have $1.9 billion to support women's economic security, to retrain for a new job, to acquire new skills, to take on an apprenticeship, or as an employer, to take on an apprentice, to take stock mid-career and take a different direction. All of these opportunities and choices are funded through this budget, and we can make this possible when we give women a secure future. Mr Speaker, the childcare investment alone will add up to 300,000 hours of work a week, allowing mothers, fathers and carers up to 40,000 people to work an extra day a week and boosting GDP by $1.5 billion a year. Mr Speaker, I'm particularly proud of how we're helping women into non-traditional trade occupations, including in construction, where we've got a great partnership with Master Builders Australia in their Women Building Australia program, which focuses on mentoring and supporting women to achieve success in what's historically a male-dominated profession. It's vital that everyone feel secure in their workplace. The Morrison government is committed to building a new culture of respect in Australian workplaces, one that calls out and prohibits sexual harassment. This budget delivers the funding to implement our response to respect at work. We know, Mr Speaker, that many women, particularly those in the later stages of their life, can find themselves suddenly financially vulnerable. It can stem from family breakdown, poor superannuation balances at retirement, or just from being on the wrong side of the gender pay gap throughout your career. We want to see improved retirement incomes for women. We want to see improved retirement incomes for women. We will remove the $450 per month threshold under which employees
If the minister would
are
just
not
pause
paid.
for a second, just for members interjecting. Look, this is question time. Questions get asked and they get answered. It's not an opportunity for a rolling conversation. The Minister has the call.
We'll remove the $450 superannuation guarantee per month threshold to improve those superannuation balances. We've got the family home guarantee to help single-parent families into home ownership. We're undertaking all of these measures not just for the benefit of Australian women and to help them achieve personal economic security, but to improve the economic security of Australia as a whole, particularly in rural and regional Australia, where I must say it's great to see women leading the way as families move from city to country with more opportunities and more choices.
I call the member for Hindmarsh.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. I refer to page 36 of Budget Paper No. 1, which states a population-wide vaccination program is likely to be in place by the end of 2021. Will the Prime Minister now guarantee that all Australians will be fully vaccinated against COVID by the end of this year?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As the member I'm sure would know, these are assumptions, Mr Speaker, that the Treasury put together in the budget to guide their assessment of the estimates that they prepare. That is not a policy statement, nor it is a policy commitment of the government, Mr Speaker. It is a Treasury assumption that has been put in place, and it makes no reference, I note, to second doses. It only refers to doses. Mr Speaker, the vaccination program that the government is rolling out in partnerships with the states and territories, Mr Speaker, we expect to achieve some 3 million doses by the end of this week. The numbers in just from yesterday show that together with the states and territories, and in particular our GPs around the country, they are making strong progress each and every day, Mr Speaker, and more Australians are coming, Mr Speaker, to get their vaccinations. Now, Mr Speaker, over the course of this week, as we move into next Monday, from next Monday, those aged over 50 will be able to go to their GP and receive their AstraZeneca vaccine, and I encourage them to do that. But where we stand right now is just over 10% of the eligible adult population has now received their first dose. Mr Speaker, over 30%, about a third of those aged over 70, and Mr Speaker, about 80% now of the aged care facilities have also had their first dose, and the vaccination program will continue to roll out in coordination with the plan that we have agreed with the National Cabinet members in partnership with the states and territories. So we will be moving as quickly as possible based on the supplies of vaccines, and I commend the Minister for Health that we continue, Mr Speaker, to access those additional supplies of vaccines, particularly for the Pfizer vaccines, to be able to bring forward as much as we possibly can to ensure that those vaccines can be provided to the under 50 population. So, Mr Speaker, the vaccination program will continue to roll out. It will continue to roll out, Mr Speaker. The Treasury have made their assumptions around the budget, and I can refer members to those assumptions. I would refer members to the government's policy statements in relation to the timing of the program.
The member for Sturt.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Employment, Workforce Skills, Small and Family Business. Will the minister update the House on how the Morrison government is securing our recovery by protecting jobs today and driving jobs growth for the future?
The Minister for Employment, Workforce Skills, Small and Family Business has the call.
Let me thank the member for Sturt for his question, and note this week data has come out showing the strongest gains in online job ads are from the honourable member state in South Australia, with a staggering increase of 61.3% pre-COVID. Indeed, the vacancy report from the National Skills Commission shows that job advertisements seasonally adjusted are up 3.3% month on month, standing at 243,500 jobs right now for Australians to take. It's the 12th consecutive month of increase in job advertisements, which are now 245% above the level recorded in April 2020. It's an extraordinary result as the economy kicks back. And as the Prime Minister has said, if you have a go, you'll get a go. And right now, Australians are certainly having a crack.
Members on my
the
left.
Unemployment rate, as we saw, at 5.6%, and 13.1 million Australians are in work today, over 100,000 more than pre-COVID. And as the Prime Minister has said, the only country at the OECD to achieve this result, which I can see those opposite are applauding the government for. Indeed, the budget is driving Australia's economic recovery through more jobs and more skills, and there has never been a better time for Australians to get skills. Indeed, there's 1.16 million Australians on job seeker or youth allowance other, 120,000 less than 1 month ago, 10% of people off payment in 1 month, extraordinary. And there's a great opportunity for Australians now to get skilled. The budget has a $1 billion job trainer fund continuance to deliver low-fee or fee-free training places in areas of skill needs. This will ensure that Australians can get access to critical skills, 10,000 places in digital skills, 33,800 places in the aged care sector for critical skills. We're also investing $1.5 billion to support the employment of newly commenced apprentices and trainees, assisting school leavers and job seekers, especially during the peak hiring period for key industries. And this will see the apprenticeship commencements wage subsidy extend for a further 6 months through to March 2022 to pick up all the school leavers who will be finishing school at the end of this year. The Morrison government will deliver, furthermore, the single biggest transformation of the employment services model that we've seen in over 2 decades. The new employment services model will modernise exactly how government has connections with job seekers and how they connect with employers, placing job seekers in the centre of their journey to getting a job with a very strong digital focus. This budget is 100% focused on skilling and getting Australians into jobs.
The member for Hindmarsh.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is again to the Prime Minister. I refer to his previous answer in which he said that his budget was based on assumptions, not policy settings. If the budget's assumptions aren't based on policy settings, what are they based on? And why can't the Prime Minister give a clear answer to the question, when will Australians be vaccinated?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I'll ask the Minister for Health to provide a further update to the figures that I've just mentioned to you about the progress of the vaccination program, but I know it is a mystery to those opposite about how budgets are put together and how they work, Mr Speaker. There are assumptions in the budget that Treasury pull together based on their assessment of the circumstances, and that helps them with their assessment of estimates, Mr Speaker. That's how budgets are done. I know it's been a long time since they've been in an expenditure review committee, Mr Speaker, and they don't have the skills or the experience to understand how budgets are put together. They didn't do a particularly good job of it when they were last in government, Mr Speaker. So it may be a mystery to them. Perhaps we should offer them courses in how budgets are put together. Perhaps that could be one of the many courses. There's a lot of training courses, Mr Speaker, that we're providing. Maybe we should introduce a training course to the Labor Party how to prepare a budget, Mr Speaker, how to engage in responsible expenditure to secure Australia's future. Perhaps we should put training programs in the Labor Party on how to develop economic policies, Mr Speaker, to support the Australian people. But I'll allow the Minister for Health to add further to the answer.
The Minister for Health. The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And to add to the Prime Minister's answer, the very simple response is yesterday 72,000 Australians were vaccinated, today 76,000 Australians. In the last week we had 402,000, a record number, and what we're seeing is those numbers increasing. Over the course of the year, we expect to have 40 million Pfizer vaccines in Australia. All of these things are, of course, dependent, as Treasury notes, on the ability of these vaccines to arrive in the country. Our expectation is that those vaccines will be available, that supply will be available. We're seeing this week 1 million CSL vaccines being made available. Some have to be provisioned for contingency for second doses, but we are distributing approximately 900,000 doses this week. So what we are doing is ensuring that over the course of the year that we do have supply for all Australians to have the opportunity to be vaccinated. And what that does, though, is that gives us greater security, greater protection as a nation. the most fundamental of all assumptions within the budget with regards to COVID is that Australia continues to be safe. Of all of the elements, that is the one with the most significant importance. We are now, on the advice I have today, at 83 days with 0 cases of community transmission. And so that assumption looks as if it is going to be a very strong assumption. And what we see from that, what we see in relation to the capacity to supply enough vaccines for every Australian who chooses to, to have that opportunity over the course of the year, they remain strong and clear.
The member for Reid.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health and Aged Care. Will the minister outline to the House how the Morrison government's budget is guaranteeing essential services and supporting the mental health of Australians?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And I do want to thank the member for Reid, who's had a professional commitment and a personal commitment to the mental health of Australians throughout her entire adult life. And this budget invests in essential services on a variety of fronts within the health space. Of course, we see a $6 billion investment in Medicare over and above that which was there, an increase. We go from 30 to 31 to 32 to $33 billion per annum over the course of the budget. In aged care, a $17.7 billion increase, which will take aged care from 26 to 29 to 31 to $33 billion, almost as much as Medicare over the course of the final year of the forward estimates. But one of the most important investments is in mental health, and every single person in this chamber is interested in mental health as a member of parliament, but also as a mother or father, as a son or daughter, as a friend, as somebody within their community. We all know the challenges and the ravages of mental health. We saw predictions of catastrophic outcomes in terms of suicide last year. On the latest advice I have, thankfully we have been spared that, but there's still so much more to do on suicide prevention. And in mental health, we're investing $2.3 billion to sit around the budget cabinet table with the Prime Minister and the Treasurer, for whom this was an equal passion, was a great privilege. And to see that we've been able to invest in a national mental health and suicide prevention plan, which is transformative, is extraordinarily important. That will have 5 pillars. It will see $250 million go into prevention and early intervention for resilience for all Australians, but particularly young Australians. $300 million go into suicide prevention, $1.4 billion into treatment for a new national network of treatment centres for adults, for youth and for children, the Head to Health program, which will stand alongside the Headspace program, $100 million for vulnerable Australians with a particular focus on our Indigenous communities, and $200 million for workforce and governance. But in particular, with regards to suicide prevention, the Prime Minister said to me and to Christine Morgan, what's the single thing that will save the most lives? And Christine Morgan said, as a result of her work, universal aftercare. That means for every person who has attempted suicide and been discharged, the capacity to have a program that will follow them. And there's $158 million for a universal aftercare program. It's something which has been summarised very simply by Suicide Prevention Australia, where the head of Suicide Prevention Australia, Neves Murray, said the additional investment in services to support people who have survived a suicide attempt will save lives. There couldn't be a more important investment.
Has concluded. The member for Hindmarsh.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is again to the Prime Minister, and I refer to his previous answer in which the Prime Minister said that the budget's assumption on vaccinations was for only 1 dose to be delivered by the end of the year. But Josh Butler reports that the Treasurer told his press conference yesterday that the budget assumptions was that Australians will get 2 doses by the end of the year. Which is it, Prime Minister?
Oh, it doesn't really.
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The budget papers themselves make no reference to first or second doses, Mr Speaker. It makes no reference to either of them, Mr Speaker.
Members on my left.
And I've been very clear in the medical advice, Mr Speaker, that we've received that we are working as quickly as we can together with the states and territories to ensure we get as many Australians vaccinated as quickly as possible, Mr Speaker. That's exactly what we're doing. We're doing it with the states and territories, Mr Speaker. The vaccination program continues to be rolled out, and it will be done so with the support particularly of our general practitioners around the country. So, Mr Speaker, that's the plan. That's what we're executing. Now, Mr Speaker, it is the next day after the budget. It's the next day after the budget, Mr Speaker, and as we come to this dispatch box and talk about economic plans, Mr Speaker, we get questions from the Shadow Health Minister, the Shadow Treasurer, Mr Speaker.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat.
Is he?
Prime Minister, his microphone is off. Members on both sides. Members on both sides, the Deputy Prime Minister. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker, on 2 points. One, the Prime Minister continues to sledge members of the opposition rather than answer questions. Secondly, on relevance, if the Prime Minister doesn't understand that the vaccine rollout affects the economy, then I'm not quite sure how we can explain that to him.
Just say, members on my left, the Prime Minister wasn't being relevant when he started a general character assessment of those opposite. He needs to be relevant to the question, and I'm not sure what's happening. Yep, you called. Yep. So, all right. So now I'm calling the Minister for Health.
Just to add to a little bit, thank you very much. And as the Prime Minister said, the assumptions in the budget are very clear in terms of the ability for Australia to have a whole-of-population vaccination program. And let me deal with this sort of micro game. There's a very
members on my left. Members on my left.
No.
Minister for Health, if you just pause for a second.
No, I can deal with this.
Minister, will just pause for a second. The Minister for Health has the call.
The assumption is for a whole-of-population vaccination program, and the difference between a first and second shot for Pfizer, which is what we're doing in the final quarter, is 3 weeks. So if you have the whole of population during the course of the year, and this is very simple to understand, if you have the whole of population during the course of the year, if those people who complete their vaccination by the 9th of December will be done this year, and if there are those that occur in the last few days of the year, then by definition those 3 weeks will occur on the other side of the calendar. But what does that mean? It means that our goal is to ensure that the whole of population has the opportunity through supply to access a vaccine this year, and if there are some who choose, because of personal circumstances, to have it in the last couple of weeks of the year, and that then means they go into the first week of the next year, that does not affect any of the assumptions. So the answer is very simple. The difference between the two is only the difference of 3 weeks, and for the opposition to think that that is material or germane is deceptive and inaccurate.
The member for Curtin.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Women. Will the Minister update the House on steps the Morrison government is taking to improve the safety of women and children, including through this year's budget?
The Minister representing the Minister for Women.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Curtin for her question and acknowledge her leadership in this important area. Whether it be the sickening and sadly too frequent incidences of intimate partner violence or the emerging challenges of online abuse, harassment, stalking, family, domestic and sexual violence in all the pernicious forms that it takes must stop. Everyone has the right to safety in their homes, their workplaces, their places of study, in the community and online. Everyone. And I would, Mr Speaker, like to acknowledge the many women and children who've spoken out about their own intensely personal and harrowing stories, often at their own cost. They are brave and their leadership helps change the future for other women. Within our $3.4 billion women's budget, we are committing $1.1 billion for women's safety, the largest single Commonwealth investment in women's safety in a federal budget. Funding for prevention and frontline services, perpetrator interventions, research so we can build our evidence base, emerging issues such as how technology is being increasingly used for coercive control. This budget represents the Commonwealth's down payment on the next plan to reduce violence against women and their children, which will commence in mid-2022. So there is further investment to follow after the consultations which we will have with the states, including the National Women's Safety Summit to be held on the 29th and 30th of July. Some of the comprehensive range of measures the government is committing to now include a new national partnership agreement with states and territories to bolster frontline family support to combat domestic and sexual violence, immediate financial assistance to women leaving violent relationships, delivering up to $5,000 to help start to establish a home away from violence. More funds to the states and territories for legal services. Now, our most vulnerable women, many in rural and regional Australia where I come from, who have been victims of violence, will now be able to get help from a local community legal centre, a door that has not been previously open to everyone. The women who work in those centres understand the needs of those who walk through that door. Mr Speaker, the government is steadfast in its commitment to improve the services and outcomes for women and children, and I know that I'm joined by all members of this place who stand by in that resolution.
The member for Dobell.
Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Page 40 of Budget Paper number 1 states slower vaccine rollouts will weigh on recoveries. Will the Prime Minister now admit his slow, bungled vaccine rollout is weighing on Australia's economic recovery? Does the Prime Minister expect Australians to believe a first-rate economic recovery is possible with a third-rate vaccine rollout?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, we've seen this a lot from the Labor Party over the course of the last 18 months. While we are fighting the virus, Mr Speaker, the Labor Party just wants to fight the government, Mr Speaker. That's when they're not fighting each other, Mr Speaker. Our job is to fight the virus. And in this budget, Mr Speaker, what you see is further commitments, whether it's to the vaccination program and the securing of vaccines and ensuring that vaccination program is rolling out. What you'll also notice in those budget papers, Mr Speaker, that the biggest threat in the short term, Mr Speaker, particularly while the virus is still raging around the world, is to ensure that we keep our internal borders open in this country, and that is what is noted in the assumptions of Treasury in these budget papers, that we need to keep those broader international borders shut to ensure we can protect Australia from the COVID-19 pandemic that is raging around the country. And I would have thought, Mr Speaker, that in this place, as we are seeking to vaccinate the country, that there would be bipartisan support for that initiative, Mr Speaker. But if those opposite can't bring themselves in a united national effort to fight this vaccine, then I will let the Australian people judge them for that, Mr Speaker. But on that vaccination program, as we speak today,
members on
the
my
rate
left.
of vaccinations, Mr Speaker, at this time compared to comparative countries that are in a situation, Mr Speaker, just like Australia, where we've had low rates of cases. Let's go, Mr Speaker. Our vaccination rate is higher than New Zealand. It's higher than South Korea. It's higher than Canada, Mr Speaker. It's higher than Japan. Those opposite, Mr Speaker, in the middle of a pandemic, seek to undermine and play politics with the health of this nation, Mr Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition, the Labor Party, may be desperate, Mr Speaker. They may be desperate. They may have no answers. They may have no plan, Mr Speaker. They may have no clue. But I can guarantee the Leader of the Opposition this. He may wish to fight me, Mr Speaker, but I'm fighting this virus on behalf of the Australian people.
Members on both sides. The member for Goldstein.
Thank you, Speaker. Speaker,
My question is to the Minister for Industry, Science and Technology. Will the minister outline to the House how the Morrison government's budget is securing our recovery by driving industry growth and scientific development, helping to further drive jobs growth for Australian workers to build Australia's future and secure its economic prosperity?
The Minister for Industry, Science and Technology.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. And I know that he represents some wonderful manufacturing industries in his electorate. And indeed, if you look at the manufacturing industries in Australia, they were hit very hard and faced enormous challenges during the height of the COVID lockdowns. But one of the remarkable things, and under the stewardship of this government, those manufacturing industries were incredibly resilient and adaptable. And those manufacturing industries now demonstrate that employment in the manufacturing sector in Australia is almost at pre-COVID levels, and it is on the rise, which is a remarkable result after the challenges that they face. And that also relates to the Australian government's modern manufacturing strategy. That strategy, based on similar programs, is estimated to have the capacity to increase direct manufacturing jobs over the next decade by another 80,000 jobs, which again will build on great work that has seen that manufacturing sector growing and thriving in Australia. And last night's budget, Mr Speaker, implemented the Morrison government's plan for manufacturing even further. It will create further jobs and secure Australia's world-leading recovery from the COVID pandemic by combining science, technology and manufacturing. And in last night's budget, there was $387 million dedicated to the Square Kilometre Array Telescope in Western Australia. That will see Australia host the larger part of what will be the world's largest and most powerful radio telescope, which will be on the cutting edge of scientific discovery. It will also create hundreds of local jobs in my home state of Western Australia. Last night's budget also included $116 million for the Australian Nuclear Science and Technology Organisation. That builds on the $238 million in last year's budget to maintain our vital sovereign nuclear medicine manufacturing capability. And having recently visited that facility, that sovereign nuclear medicine manufacture capability will benefit over our lives 2 in every 3 of Australians who will benefit from the medicines that are manufactured at that great facility. And all of this builds on last year's budget, which allocated $1.5 billion to Australian government's modern manufacturing strategy. And all of this together has shown this remarkable result, that even after all of the challenges that the manufacturing sector has faced through COVID and the height of the COVID lockdowns, the AI Group's Performance Manufacturing Index shows that this is a flourishing sector now in Australia. And they looked at 6 of the main manufacturing sectors and analysed that all of them in April were expanding. In each of those 6 sectors, they are expanding. And then there were further developments in last night's budget. A new patent box for medical and biotech sectors, where income earned from new patents will be taxed at the concessional rate of 17%, all contributing to the sector's great growth.
The member for Ballarat.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. 7 weeks ago, after repeated questioning, the Prime Minister told the House his Chief of Staff would begin a process to respond to Brittany Higgins' formal complaint that the Prime Minister's office had undermined her loved ones. What is the outcome of that process?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Speaker, my Chief of Staff has continued to progress this matter, allowing for due process to be afforded to those involved. He has spoken with members of my office, members of the press gallery and others in the course of his work, and I understand Ms Higgins has agreed to assist him in his inquiries, and I expect this process to conclude when all matters have been able to be taken into consideration, including relevant information from Ms Higgins.
The member for Braddon.
Thanks, Mr Speaker.
Member for Braddon has the call.
My question is to the Minister for Agriculture, Drought and Emergency Management. Will the minister outline to the House how the Morrison government's Ag 20 plan, Ag 30 plan, will ensure our agricultural industry is resilient to biosecurity incursions and able to secure our economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic?
The Minister for Agriculture has the call.
Mr Speaker, I thank the member for Braddon for his question. He, as a former farmer, would know more than anyone the importance of biosecurity, not just to our nation's security, but also to the nearly 339,000 Australians that are employed in agriculture. And that's why, in supporting agriculture's ambitious goal of $100 billion by 2030, we've devised our Ag 2030 plan. And one of the key pillars to that is biosecurity and making sure we're backing it with cash. And last night, I'm proud to say that this government invested a further $400 million on top of the $888 million that we committed in the budget in October to making sure we protect those borders. And part of that, nearly $30 million, is around the eradication of pests. That is making sure we're removing deer, pig and dogs out of the landscape to protect our biosecurity risk, but also protecting our environment. We've also, as part of this, is looking to modernise our biosecurity systems, evolving as the threats evolve. And that's not just putting boots on the ground and paws on the ground, that's also making sure that we're investing in technology, putting in new scientists, increasing the number of scientists so that we can have real-time decision-making processes where we understand the threats as they appear, making sure that we have the ability to eradicate them as quickly as we possibly can. But technology is the way forward, and that's why we've invested in 3D X-ray machines that we've put in to our postal services. 144 million parcels go through Australia Post every year, and now, with artificial intelligence and 3D X-rays, we'll be able to detect any organic matter or plant life, and in fact we'll be evolving this technology to be able to detect any animal life within these parcels, so that our officers can actually intercept and protect through the system. We're also working with international partners to adopt this technology, so that before someone leaves a country, we will know what's in their bag, if it is an organic matter, if it has plant life, so that we can deploy the resources on the spot to make sure that we can protect Australia. Because an outbreak of foot and mouth disease would cost us around $50 billion, just that alone. So it's important we continue to protect our biosecurity borders, and we're complementing that with increased penalties. And I'm proud to say that since we introduced new penalties in October 2019, we have cancelled the visas of 14 overseas visitors who failed to declare on their declaration cards. Such was the seriousness of the infringement. We also lifted the on-spot fines from $444 to $2,664, and to importers lifting it from $400,000 to over $1 million, plus paying a penalty of 10 years of jail. This is about protecting Australia's borders, but it's also, more importantly, about protecting the jobs of Australian agriculture.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.